series of articles. There are titles that I won't attempt to pronounce, but I...
Okay, so appropriately for a day on nihilism, I'll stand in front of a non-functioning microphone. Just two brief remarks. Firstly, obviously, thanks to Sami, the remnants of the Jan van Eyck in its moment of extinction first came here in 2004, if my memory serves, and obviously won't say too much more except I regret what has happened. And just notice the poster about building the future. We're building the past. And just a related remark also, I hope it won't become too evident that I'm not a scholar of Benjamin, but I hope I still have something interesting to say. So the paper should hopefully last about 40 minutes, if I've got my timings right. So, the organisation of destruction. Destruction and production usually appear as antonyms. In the case of Walter Benjamin, I want to suggest that this is not the case, or not a simple case. Nicola Guess has recently remarked in regards to Benjamin's use of the figure of the child that in his work, quote, analytical destruction and steady new creation mutually specify each other. In fact, Guess suggests that Benjamin deliberately leaves this mutual specification quite unspecified. While we are familiar with the destructive and anti-productive Benjamin, the Benjamin of the destructive character and on the concept of history, both of which I'll discuss, my argument probes a rather different image in which, to again quote Guess, destruction enables new production. But this organisation of destruction will prove to be a much more complicated story than it might initially appear. To make this argument, I want to probe Benjamin's fraught dialogue with Brecht. Frederick Jameson remarks that the lineaments of a later, profoundly Brechtian Benjamin have not yet clearly emerged. My task here is a more modest one, to trace how Benjamin's concern with Brecht's politics of production, especially in the form of refunctioning, I won't attempt the German for very many reasons, tells a tangled story of the attempt to wrest production from its capitalist framing, and at the same time to wrest destruction from a correlation with capitalist creative destruction. What interests me in this fraught story is the difficulty recently probed by Sami in his paper, Historical Materialism, of tracking an asymmetrical negation, one that would produce, ironically, a rupture with capital's own negativity. Sami's just suggested, and did at more length at HM, the thought image of the destructive character promises to embody this asymmetrical negation. By retracing Benjamin's occulted debate with Brecht on production, I want to suggest that this embodiment is a more complex and difficult matter. The organisation of destruction is a process without guarantees and remarkably unstable. So, Benjamin and Brecht. Gershom Scholem has noted that Brecht entered Benjamin's life as an elemental force. I want to suggest that one way to read this force is through Brecht's insistence on production. When Benjamin came to know Brecht in the early 1930s, we find Brecht articulating his critical practice of cultural and political production as a coming to terms with the crisis-ridden and destructive effects of capital, the wake of 1929 and the experience of German inflation in particular. One key statement of Brecht's thought of production can be found in Badiou's analysis of Brecht's poem, The Proletariat Wasn't Born in a White Vest, from 1934. The poem presents a litany of capitalist decline, before concluding its final two lines. Oh, on that day, the proletariat will be able to take charge of a culture reduced to the same state in which it found production, in ruins. According to Badiou, the poem is founded on the essential thematic that the new can only come about as the seizure of a ruin. Novelty will only take place on the basis of a fully accomplished destruction. We can risk a paraphrase that a new state of production can only be found on the self-destruction of capital, on what Badiou calls a nourishing decomposition. To take Brecht at his most provocative, we could consider this remark. Behaviorism is a psychology which begins with the needs of commodity production in order to develop methods with which to influence buyers, i.e. is an active psychology, progressive and revolutionising cathode. In keeping with its capitalist function, it has its limits. The reflexes are biological. Only in a few Chaplin films are they already social. Here too, the path leads only over the dead body of capitalism. But here too, this is a good path. Here, refunctioning turns on the most extreme form of capitalist technology as the means to find a good path over the dead body of capitalism, which is to say, to find what Badiou calls a nourishing decomposition that can be reworked or retooled. We have to traverse what Benjamin calls, in perhaps my favourite phrase, summing up the bad news, calls the dirty diapers of the present. In his conversations with Brecht, Benjamin mentions the destructive aspect of Brecht's character, which puts everything in danger almost before it has been achieved. That Brecht is one of the models for Benjamin's The Destructive Character is by now commonplace, thanks to Irving's work in particular. Rather than go back to the debates on the effect of Brecht's friendship on Benjamin's work, taken as negative by both Adorno and Scholem, I want to consider the provocation Brecht's destructive character offered to Benjamin in thinking about destruction and production. Nicola Guest points out the implication of a, quote, interweaving of destruction and production in Benjamin's essay on the destructive character, but as one that's not instantiated. Irving remarks that Benjamin's commentaries on Brecht likewise turn on the dismantling and retooling of person, name and function. My suggestion is that if we read these two comments together, we can suggest that Brecht himself plays the equivocal role of the bad new. It is Brecht who instantiates a practice of retooling. In the same conversations with Benjamin, Brecht remarks on Lukács and others who are opposing him in Russia. They are, to put it bluntly, enemies of production. Production makes them uncomfortable. You never know where you are with production. Production is unforeseeable. You never know what's going to come out. Therefore, we have a coordination between destruction and production, and one that I want to argue is taken up by Benjamin. Brecht's ethics of production, as Jameson puts it, suggests a new, variable and unforeseeable practice. So, contra Sami to some extent, in regards to the destructive character, we might say it's also the productive character in this new sense. Irving remarks that in comparison to Benjamin's invocation of the brooding melancholiac in The Origin of German Tragic Drama, the destructive character is his cheerful counterpart. Instead of interpreting the world, he changes it. The one inhabits an inner labyrinth, all the others' paths lead to success. What I'm suggesting is that the relation of production and destruction that we find in the destructive character is equivocal. Again, to dispute with Sami, I don't think we can assert that this character is non-creative or by implication non-productive. Instead, my suggestion is that it renders an unforeseeable production. It's a quote from the essay on the destructive character. He has few needs, least of all to know what will take the place of the destroyed. This can be traced in Benjamin's appeal to a certain politics of production, to what he calls my little writing factory in a letter. Of course, the destructive character can be seen as the figuration of a disruption of capitalist production, and especially of creative destruction. And yet it still lies in an equivocal proximity. Again, to quote Irving's essay, the destructive character is rather describable only in negative, tangential relation to existing models of destruction. He is, however, no intangible deus absconditas, but rather the efficient executor of an eviction order. What kind of eviction order? One example of such an eviction order can be found in Brecht's short story, probably written in 1926, North Sea Shrimps. Great title. Subtitled, Or the Modern Bauhaus Apartment. The story tells the visit of Müller and the narrator to the apartment of their wartime friend Camper. Camper is committed to a life of luxury after his experiences in the trenches of the First World War, and having married into money, fulfills his dream. The apartment he lives in is perfect Bauhaus, whereas before, quote, it was 2 plain bourgeois rooms. You know the kind of thing, cramped to the start with and then stowed to the gunnels with furniture. That is to say, exactly the kind of bourgeois interior that horrified Benjamin. and horrifies me. My experience in the hotel this morning. Weird dolls staring at me. I felt. So this is a Bauhaus apartment. The all-lilac room, the delicate blinds, the lack of pictures drive the narrator, and particularly Müller, to distraction. What irritated Müller was the flat. He was completely wrong about this. It was a very pleasant flat, not at all ostentatious. But I think Müller just could not stand the carefully contrived harmony and the dogmatic functionalism of it any longer. Although Müller has brought a present of North Sea shrimps, he sends out Camper on a false errand to buy some and then proceeds to some redecoration. He violently rearranges the furniture, tears down the blind, and sticks up magazine pictures on the wall with sugar water. The narrator concludes, "Man is like a terrible tornado, creating the grandiose multiplicity and admirable disharmony of all creation out of an almighty pile-up of patent American chaise lounge, common wash basins, and old venerable magazines." So this short story seems something of a counter-response in advance to Benjamin's later invocation of the glass architecture of Scherbach and Bauhaus in Experience and Poverty in 1933, which he correlates as a gesture of erasing the traces called for by Brecht. The creation of, quote, rooms in which it is hard to leave traces is exactly what Brecht's destructive character is reacting against, with Müller, quote, having this longing for all that was most ill-matched, most illogical, and most natural. So, in the case of Brecht, the production of the new is founded in this amateur destruction of the new, which I think is an interesting equivocation, which problematizes the link made by Benjamin and the destructive character between what Irving calls the anti-cultural figures, destroyers of ornament, lose, cliché, carouse, catharsis, Brecht, and so on. So, not only do we have a complication of Benjamin's later schema here, I also want to suggest we have a different sense of approaches to the bad new. To refer again to Benjamin, he remarks on how Brecht intends the revolutionary to emerge spontaneously from the bad and selfish character, again, quite without any special ethical transformation. Just as Wagner hoped to create a homunculus in a test tube from a magical mixture, so Brecht wants to create test tube revolutionaries out of baseness and vileness. The destructive baseness of Müller, his lumpen status, to refer to Sami's argument, is what can be alchemized into a new production. But whether this is for or against the modern, qua new, remains to be decided. In line with Brecht's practice and Benjamin's reading, we can see this as a practice of cunning and vulgarity. And it's striking when Nicola Guess invokes the strategy of cunning in her essay on Benjamin's use of the child. She doesn't refer to Brecht at all. He's associated with that. Therefore, Brecht proffers a model of character and practice that passes through baseness and vileness. In Frederick Jameson's resonant formulation, the Brechtian aversion to respectability in general is richly documented in the early works, with Baal as its virtual allegory. The Marxian turn is thereby able to tap those antisocial, in quotes, energies for a new and more productive engagement with the negative. We could transfer without much difficulty the same judgment to Benjamin through his encounter with Brecht. Benjamin, in his encounter with Brecht, taps the antisocial energies that Brecht had already tapped and modulated in his encounter with Marxism, so a process of transferal between them. Therefore, the destructive character makes room, I'm suggesting, for a new form of production, a strategy of cunning. Again, to quote Irving's essay, "For here is the destroyer who husbands his resources. He does not squander his energies on uneconomical acts of protest, but remains in control of his powers. He reduces the existing to rubble, not for the sake of the rubble, but of the path that extends through it." It's Benjamin's words, the end. This seems to me a kind of paraphrase of Brecht's remark that the path leads only over the dead body of capitalism, but here too it is a good path. So there's a kind of congruence in this point. To close this part of the argument in its most provocative forms, I want to turn to some remarks by Slavoj Žižek on Brecht. You can always go to Žižek for provocation. Žižek remarks that Brecht is the ultimate Stalinist artist, for whom the harshness of the violence of Stalinism as such, was perceived and endorsed as a sign of authenticity. He also quotes Brecht's remark after the de-Stalinisation of 1956, this is Brecht, "Without a knowledge of dialectics, passages like the one from Stalin as the motor of progress to Stalin as its brake cannot be understood." I'll come back to the brakes in a moment. Of course, Zizek goes on to argue that it's the very over-orthodoxy of Brecht, his hyper-Stalinism, that makes him intolerable in a Stalinist universe. Whether that's true or not, I want to suggest it's an extreme point of tension of the Brechtian temptation to Benjamin. Is the production embraced through destruction compatible with Stalinism? Obviously, Brecht's analysis of production doesn't really seem to conform to Stalinism's politics of production. Stalinism rests on a storming, discipline, obedience and conformity to achieve the necessary historical acceleration, and where slowing the tempo becomes a counter-revolutionary act. Brecht's invocation of a politics of temporality in relation to Stalin, Stalin as accelerator, Stalin as brake, speaks equivocally to this problem. See, also in the case of Benjamin, we should not read his new positive concept of barbarism as quasi-Stalinist. In fact, in a note written in 1940, Benjamin conceded that certain formulations in Brecht's poetry were in absolute proximity with the methods of the Stalinist GPU. And also you've got Schollem's remarks about Benjamin's kind of equivocations on the Stalinist show trials. So there is a tension and equivocation here. What I want to suggest that there is a splitting or an attempt to split destruction from production, but this struggles to instantiate an asymmetry that would resist both capitalism and Stalinism's politics of production. This is true of the key example of Benjamin's Brechtiana, the author as producer essay. It's the essay that Schollem refers to, probably snidely, I'm guessing, knowing Schollem, as an apex of Benjamin's materialistic efforts. For Benjamin, the refunctioning of literature is a result of new technologies producing a molten mass from which the new forms are cast. Again, the process of destruction of old forms is the condition for the new, which has to traverse this melting down process. Benjamin stresses the necessity of an organising function of this destruction. This is a key point. He takes Brecht's epic theatre as the model for this organisation, but one which operates through interruption. To quote Benjamin, yet interruption here has the character not of a stimulant, but of an organising function. And it's this question of interruption that I want to follow as a crucial thread. It already suggests a reading of Brecht that runs counter to the claim that his creation of the new is simply dependent on acceleration or immersion in the destructive forces. Trains. Dangerously. As I was joking on Facebook, relying on 3 train services of 3 countries to present a paper about train crashes. Fortunately, it hasn't come true yet. I have to return on 3 train services. There's still time. Locomotives, trains. In his essay on Benjamin's radio broadcast for children, Geoffrey Melman draws attention to Benjamin's 1932 talk, The Railway Disaster at the Firth of Tay. As the title suggests, the central subject of the essay is the railway disaster of the 28th of December 1879, when a passenger train of 6 carriages and 200 people was lost after plunging into the Tay when the iron bridge it was passing over collapsed during a fierce storm. Benjamin does not begin with the disaster, but rather with the early technologies of ironworking and train construction, and with what he calls in the essay on Edouard Fuchs, the defective reception of technology. This defective reception turns in part in his talk on acceleration, with the medical faculty at Erlangen suggesting that the speed of rail travel would lead to cerebral lesions, while an English expert suggested that moving by train is not travel, but simply being dispatched to a destination like a package. I would suggest that neither of these authorities could foresee the current British rail system. There's no danger of cerebral lesions or being delivered to your destination. In terms of describing the disaster itself, Benjamin quotes from a poem by Theodore Fontaine, not the renowned poem by William Topaz McGonagall, renowned for being terrible, which I can give you some of the McGonagall poem. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. So it goes on if you wish to consult it on the internet. It's a moving tribute. Benjamin reports how when the accident occurred, the storm was raging so severely that it was not evident what had happened. The only signs were flames seen by fishermen who did not realise that this was the result of the locomotive plunging into the water. They did alert the station master at Tay, who sent another locomotive along the line. The train was inched onto the bridge and had to be stopped a kilometre out before reaching the first central pier with a violent application of the brakes that nearly led to the train jumping from the tracks. To quote Benjamin, the moonlight had enabled him to see a gaping hole in the line. The central section of the bridge was gone. Geoffrey Melman, not necessarily surprisingly, passes this talk on catastrophe as part of Benjamin's reflection on a gap or rift in communication. What interests me is the use of the break as interruption. While one catastrophe has already occurred, in which 200 people have lost their lives, the act of braking prevents, although only barely, a second catastrophe. And it's no great stretch to see this as prefigurative of Benjamin's later use of the emergency brake metaphor, to which I will return. Also, we can place this consideration of the locomotive, speed, and the malignancy of technology alongside another remark from Benjamin's essay on Edward Fuchs that, quote, the disciples of Saint-Simon started the ball rolling with their industrial poetry. Then came the realism of Duchamp, who saw the locomotive as the saint of the future, and a liquid fowl brought up the rear. It is quite unnecessary to become an angel, he wrote, since the locomotive is worth more than the finest pair of wings. So we have here a counterpart and semi-opposite to the Angelus Novus of the On the Concept of History, which is turned to the past, with the angelic locomotive that races forward into the future. The angelic locomotive is the sign of acceleration to the point that indicates that the, quote, energies that technology develops beyond their threshold are destructive. Benjamin. Destruction here is the technology of capitalism that is pushed beyond the threshold. We might say that the so-called productive forces of capitalism are indistinguishable at a certain point of acceleration from destructive forces. This again suggests a relation to Brecht's sensitivity to the destructive element of capitalism, which is given a more material sense in Brecht than the metaphysical one in Benjamin, and can be seen in Brecht's finale of the film Kula Wampa from 1932, with its vision of crisis as waste. I'm suggesting then that Benjamin's dialectical thought image of the locomotive interweaves destruction and production and the necessity of interruption. In his essay Surrealism, the Last Snapshot of the European Intelligentsia, 1929, Benjamin criticises the surrealists', quote, overheated embrace of the uncomprehended miracle of machines, which can be found wanting in comparison to the well-ventilated utopias of a Schierbaum. Reading forward to the essay on the destructive character, the essay on Fuchs, I would suggest that we can see this again as a reminder that we not simply embrace the accelerative and overheated function of technology. And this could be read in regards to Benjamin's Brechtian moment as something of an auto-critique or modulation. The implication is that the refunctioning Benjamin is trying to elaborate is one that brings to halt a certain dynamic or holds it in suspension. This is the displacement that is not subordinate to the ends of accumulation. We come back to Sami's points about the E means ends kind of relation. A constructive destruction, to quote Guess, that in her words, presumes great intimacy with the things it takes apart. Final section. In the I can never say this word. In the Paralopomena to On the Concept of History, Benjamin makes a well-known remark, which I've obviously already been gesturing towards fairly regularly. Marx says that revolutions are the locomotive of world history, but perhaps it is quite otherwise. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on this train, namely the human race, to activate the emergency brake. Read in the context of On the Concept of History, this appears as another form of the critique of German social democracy, elaborated in Thesis 11, where it is chided for moving with the current. The conformity of social democracy to the ideology of progress, and not least technological progress, meant that it was unable to grasp the dynamic of fascism and unable to critique capitalism effectively. This detachment of social democracy was from recognising the destructive side of technology and was, as Benjamin argued in the essay on Fuchs, due to an alienation from the destructive side of the dialectic. So there's a pairing here, a detachment from the destructive side of technology and the destructive side of the dialectic, which I think speaks to this kind of equivocation that I've been trying to get at about, which I don't really say here, but different forms of destruction. I think this is something that I need to make clear, and I probably haven't, about the different elements and forms of destruction. Destruction is therefore embedded within production for Benjamin. The movement with the current is a movement that replicates the faith in the productive forces while denying that these are also destructive forces. If we read this remark about the locomotive of world history in the context I've tried to elaborate, we could argue that the revolutionary locomotive of Marx, or a certain moment in Marx, so the 1859 preface kind of moment with Marx, is paired by Benjamin with the angelic locomotive of capitalist productivity that has gone off the rails. So we have a pairing of the critique of capitalist and Stalinist or problematic Marxist production and accelerationism. The implication is that without attention to destruction, we can only have a malignant politics of acceleration, rather than grasping the necessity of the break as the means to refunction production. In Michael Lowry's words, the image of the revolutionary break suggests implicitly that if humanity were to allow the train to follow its course, already mapped out by the steel structure of the rails, and if nothing halted its headlong dash, we would be heading straight for the disaster, for a crash or a plunge into the abyss or into the river Tay. So whereas Brecht's comment on Stalin about Stalin being accelerative or decelerative suggests a model of acceleration and deceleration that can be decided by political fiat. We can decide when Stalin was accelerative and when he wasn't. Benjamin's registering of destruction and its equivocation suggests exactly that heterogeneity of time that will find its formulation in On the Concept of History. Homogeneous empty time is the time of the train on the tracks, which can speed up and slow down. This conception was present, as Michael Lowry notes, as early as Benjamin's essay, The Life of Students from 1914, where Benjamin wrote, "There is a view of history that puts its faith in the infinite extent of time, and this concerns itself only with the speed, or lack of it, with which people and epochs advance along the path," or we could add rails, "of progress." So, the emergency break of Benjamin's metaphor for revolution is not simply the stopping of a train on the smooth tracks of progress. Rather, as with the metaphor of the angel of history, suggests to me anyway that the train tracks into the future are being laid immediately in front of the train, like you get in cartoons. I was trying to find a kind of image of this from a cartoon, but the only one I could ever find was from The Wrong Trousers, which I absolutely hate. But people say it's a trope commonly used in cartoons, but try and find it. So, in fact, the anecdote of the Tay Bridge disaster suggests that the emergency brake is applied precisely due to the derailing of the train and threatens another catastrophic derailing. The rails of history accelerate us to disaster if we are not aware of the destructive side of the dialectic of production. The irony, as Benjamin's notes make clear, is that the desire for acceleration on the tracks of history breeds passivity before the productive forces. Once the class of society has been defined as an infinite task, the empty and homogeneous time was transformed into an anteroom, so to speak, in which one could wait for the emergence of the revolutionary situation with more or less equanimity. Linking this with the neo-Kantian deviation from Marxism, the idea of the track stretching into the future leaves revolution as a receding moment, the station we never quite arrive in. The result, contrary to the revolutionary intervention, is the constant stoking of the train, i.e. the capitalist productive forces, to get you to the revolution. In this way, accelerationism, as I've called it elsewhere and associated with certain later French thinkers like Lyotard, Deleuze and Guattari, either tries to actively increase the speed of capital or simply becomes the passenger on the train, allowing the constant destruction of living labour at the hands of dead labour to do the work of revolution. The conclusion is that the emergency brake is not merely calling to a halt for the sake of it, some static stopping at a particular point in capitalist history, as if we're on the rails, stop the train. Say, Swedish social democracy, which the American Republican right now takes as a true horror of socialism. This is a weird sign of defeat. It's now Swedish social democracy. It's terrible. Neither is it a return back to some utopian pre-capitalist moment, which would run foul of Marx and Engels' anathemas against feudal socialism. Rather, Benjamin argues famously that classless society is not the final goal of historical progress, but its frequently miscarried, ultimately achieved interruption. We interrupt to prevent catastrophe, we destroy the tracks or jump the tracks to prevent the greater destruction of acceleration. In this sense, the emergency brake is the operator of Benjamin's non-teleological politics of destruction, predicated on the wresting away of the classless society from the continuing dialectic of production and destruction that is the constant state of emergency. It is this I want to suggest that is the real reinscription of Brechtian refunctioning. So we can say in response to Michael Lowry's claim that in regard to Benjamin's critique of the development of the productive forces as a sign of progress, quote, the question remains at the level of a programmatic proposal, and Benjamin does not go into it more deeply, that this may be true on the concept of history, but not if we read retrospectively or retroactively. It's exactly the debate with Brecht and Benjamin's earlier essays that provide a deeper consideration. What is Benjamin's inflection of this organisation of destruction? Perhaps the best description, or my favourite description more precisely, comes from the end of the essay Karl Kraus. For far too long, the accent was placed on creativity. People are only creative to the extent that they avoid tasks and supervision. Work as a supervised task, its model being political and technical work, is attended to by dirt and detritus, intrudes destructively into matter, is abrasive to what is already achieved and critical towards its conditions, and is in all this opposite to the work of the dilettante luxuriating in creation. I will say no more about the fate of the Eyck. What we have here is not creative destruction, but destructive production, to coin an appropriately paradoxical compound, or Guess's constructive destruction. The essays, the Karl Kraus's essays version of the destructive character is the one who, quote, feels solidarity not with the slender pine, but with the plane that devours it, not with the precious ore, but with the blast furnace that purifies it. So this is close, or too close perhaps, to Brecht, or to a problem in Brecht that is also Benjamin's. The difficulty of a transformed material that remains variable and non-positing, in Guess's words, is that variability. My suggestion is that this variability around the organisation of destruction, the creation of a, quote, humanity that proves itself by destruction, be read alongside the emergency brake as intertext and auto-critique. Rather than acceleration into destruction, we find the detachment of destruction into an integral intimacy with the things that it destroys. This is supposed by the Surrealism's essay's argument that the organisation of pessimism requires the removal of moral metaphor and the grasping of the image within, 100% within, the image sphere. In this case, action puts forth its own image without external reference. It's a method called nihilism, I think. If we read this in terms of what I'm calling the organisation of destruction, we can argue that interruption and detachment from the temporality of acceleration is required to find a real variable and non-positing construction. This would be an intimate production, a production that puts forth its own image, an insubordinate production, not coordinate to ends. Of course, whether this is enough to cope with the capacity of capital to posit its presuppositions, even or sometimes especially on destruction, remains in question. The resistance of variability has no a priori guarantee to produce the truly new. Therefore, we can consider the emergence of production as a series of experiments that have frequently miscarried and which require an ultimately achieved interruption as their real condition. Thank you.